Standing during an FTP test, I thought this went without saying, but apparently out there is some people saying that you should only stay seated when you're doing an FTP test. You need to remain seated during your FTP test because if you stand up, your power will surge, and we want to keep the test aerobic. I wholeheartedly disagree with that. If you want to stand up during your FTP test, I don't see any physiological or logistical reason to force you to remain seated when you're doing a test. By FTP test, I mean any maximal effort test where you're then taking a percentage to estimate FTP. So this could be a ramp test, 2x8, 20 minute, 40 minute, 1 hour. Now, firstly, I think there is just a gross misunderstanding of physiology by some of these people that are saying not to stand up. Standing up doesn't equal anaerobic. There are people that will just prefer naturally to stand up out of the saddle, and that doesn't mean their power's spiking. So for example, we see a lot of the time, especially people that train a lot on climbs and smaller riders, lighter riders, will find they are pretty efficient out of the saddle. So for a 20-minute test, for example, they might spend 8 to 10 minutes of that 20 minutes out of the saddle. It doesn't mean they have this huge anaerobic capacity, anaerobic engine, and they're kind of getting out of the saddle to spike the power. So telling a person like that to remain seated because you don't want them using their anaerobic stores just makes no physiological sense. What it will actually do is cause a whole other problem, and that's that it will then make the test inconsistent because there are some riders like me, for example, who during a 20-minute test, I just naturally wouldn't stand up because I'm more efficient in the saddle. So that constraint of staying seated wouldn't affect my test. If you're a climber, for example, and you're going to spend 12 out of the 20 minutes out of the saddle, and someone tells you to stay seated, that's going to really negatively impact the power output that you're able to do in a 20-minute test, and that will then impact the results. So that constraint of staying seated isn't going to fairly impact every rider. So in this attempt to make the FTP test more accurate, you're actually just making it more inconsistent between riders. Now, this idea of limiting the anaerobic contribution to an FTP test by staying seated has some merit, especially in the shorter tests, like a ramp test. There is some case where theoretically at the end of the test, let's say in the last 20 seconds, that a rider could get out of the saddle and surge and lift the power up and cause a power spike, which would then increase the peak 1 minute power from that test and therefore throw off the results. My point with this is that firstly, that's got nothing to do with being standard or being seated. Someone with a big anaerobic capacity could do a big surge in the saddle at the end of the test. So whether they're standing or sitting doesn't change that. That is a pacing issue. So that's just got to do with the instructions of the test. The test should say, don't spike your power. Hold your power exactly where it needs to be for that ramp. Don't go above it. Don't go below it. Go into your maximal. The other thing as well is for people that are doing these big almighty surges at the end of a ramp test, they probably haven't gone hard enough. I don't know if you've seen anyone at the end of a ramp test. Most people don't have the ability to do a big 30-second surge. The other thing that factors into that is that on any ramp test, you're going to be in erg mode. So the ability to which, even if you wanted to, you could surge isn't going to be that big. As soon as you stand up and surge out of the saddle, okay, you will get a power spike, but then erg mode will drop the resistance and that will come back down anyway. So even in that rare case, if someone's mispacing the test and tries to do a surge, erg mode will somewhat account for that anyway. This idea of forcing riders to be seated actually means in some ways you're getting the worst of both worlds, because there's two reasons really to do an FTP test. The first is obviously to estimate your FTP if you need that, but the other point of it is to get a maximal effort done over that duration so you can track improvement. Now, if you don't allow someone to stand up, which for some people will result in a higher power because they're efficient in that position, what you're ending up with is a 20-minute test, for example, that isn't a actual maximal 20-minuter. So you're not even getting the peak 20-minute value. And then a resultant FTP, which may or may not be more accurate depending on the individual if they had to sit down the whole time. So yeah, I think the conspiracy part of me says that these online training platforms telling everyone to sit is just masking the fact that their FTP tests aren't that accurate and tend to, for a lot of riders, overestimate FTP. So they put this constraint on saying stay seated, and for a majority of people, that results in a lower power output, a lower FTP estimation, and then that FTP ends up being more accurate. But that's an issue with the way they're calculating FTP, not the fact that you sat down the whole time. I hope that makes sense. As usual, thanks for watching this video if you've gotten this far in, and I'll catch you in the next one.